My honour this morning to give the Carlos Pijuan lecture. I first met Carlos when I came to the US in 1991, and I've known him as a mentor, as a colleague, as a friend. We lost Carlos sadly way too early in his life several years back, and now we probably have people in the audience who didn't know him. He was a towering figure in our swine medicine community globally, and particularly in Latin-speaking countries, but everywhere else. Carlos had a lot of endearing characteristics. He was a unique individual. I think the ones that stand out to me, particularly as an academic, as a mentor, was that he liked to challenge people. He liked to argue. He liked to debate, and that made him really effective in training students and training faculty, in really challenging us all. And so I think it's the content of this morning with the GMO talk, and now what I'm going to talk about antibiotics is really fitting on a morning we pay tribute to Carlos, because he would enjoy both these arguments, and they are arguments, and there's science versus opinion. So what I'll be doing over the next 50 minutes or so is really sharing some opinion, sharing some science, and really trying to see where we're going forward on this very, very contentious issue. There is a debate, and the debate has been going for 50 years at least. What we don't debate about is that when we use antibiotics in animals, we select for resistance. I think, again, the scientific consensus would be pretty much overriding there. Where we do argue is the consequences. So on one side of the ditch, we have people saying, and it's spread to humans, and there's potential for major human harm. We have to do things. We have to take action on this. On the other side of the divide, there's the but people saying, well, the evidence that it's caused problems for humans and major harm is minimal or non-existent, and no action is required. But the reality is, and I was at a meeting in Washington yesterday with infectious disease physicians on the human side, epidemiologists, talking about the resistance crisis. And it is a very, very real thing in human clinical medicine. Antibiotics are miracle drugs. I think I have one of my sons who probably would have died twice by now had he been born in the 1920s and 1930s with very acute septic infections. He recovered within 48 hours. He's back being a problem again. And so the ability to respond, and many of you, I'm sure, have had those experiences. So these drugs did transform medicine, and the consequences of people getting infections. The other part, there's no debate, is the efficacy of antibiotics is declining in human medicine. The other thing is that over the last 50, 60 years, both medicine and what we do in medicine and food animal production and agriculture and what we do there, our systems have co-evolved with the availability of antimicrobial products. So we've done a lot of things, and we've improved a lot of things with the available antibiotics there. And that's a reality both on the agricultural side and the medical side. The perception of those evolutions is very different. If we look on the human medical side, human medicine is today dependent on antibiotic use. The types of surgeries, hip replacements, all these sorts of things that are done daily, transplant, chemotherapy for cancer, all of those modern medical, which are transformational, are heavily dependent on antibiotic use. And the emergence of resistance is compromising. So I was with an infectious disease doctor yesterday who said she had a 42-year-old male patient with a heart problem. He had a device implanted. He had a resistant infection in it. They weren't able to clean it up. He needed a transplant to correct that. And he was sent to a hospice because there's no way they could give a transplant because they had an infection they couldn't use. And she said, yeah, that's not uncommon now. One of the big consequences is denying necessary advanced treatments to people because they're carrying antibiotic-resistant infection. So when you get it down at a personal, individual level, it's something that is really troubling in the medical sector, and particularly in those sectors where particularly elderly medicine, transplant medicine, which are where our healthcare system is at. The difficulty we get into is when we flip the coin and say, well, modern agriculture is also dependent on antibiotics because our systems have evolved with there. The knee-jerk response is, It's a condemnation of what you've done. You guys are doing something wrong because you'll need them. On our side, we're doing all these wonderful things. So we're in a very unlevel playing field when it comes to the debate about antibiotic use and the benefits to society of antibiotic use in these two sectors. And that's something that we will continue to be navigating through. I've spent, as Monty said, a lot of the last year engaged in this issue, and I think it's like drinking from a fire hose. If you think that you're keeping up with the antibiotic resistance issue, you're probably deluding yourself. And just last week, the FAO released an action plan globally for antibiotic use in food production. The FDA has made a call, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, about comment on products that are licensed with undefined duration. That's the next step that they are looking at in terms of trying to rationalize our antibiotic use. Citizens in the US have placed a petition in the US to look at removing claims for antibiotics for prevention and growth promotion. The growth promotion, no, is done, but this issue of preventive uses being the next thing under the target is already happening in other parts of the world, and that's something that I'll speak about a little bit over. Just the rest of it, the numbers of publications, the numbers of meetings. Starting tomorrow, there's a UN high-level meeting in New York City that is specifically targeting the use of antibiotics in the food production system. So it's going on everywhere that people are gathering at the moment. The ruling consensus, and I'm just putting that this is as a straw man, really. And this is a quote in the UN background information from a Dr. Shen, who was the scientist in China who discovered this MCR1 mobile colistin resistance gene that's I'm sure most of you heard about. And these are the statements he makes. Antibiotic use in animal agriculture is a global issue with public health implications we need to do something about. All countries should be using antibiotics in food animals more prudently. Pretty hard to argue against that, and that's something that I think we have to challenge ourselves with. And it's time to act globally to restrict or prohibit use of antibiotics. And again, growth promotion and disease prevention. And this is very much the narrative that I think we're confronting pretty much any way we go with this, both members of the community and members of the medical community, medical microbiology community. This is a quote that I've liked for a long time, and it applies to a lot of things. And idealism increases in direct proportion to one's distance from the problem. And I think when we're dealing with animal health issues and disease outbreaks in the pig sector, as many of you do on a daily basis, you have a different set of concerns and needs for action that are motivating your decision. I'm not sure how many people at the high-level meeting of the UN in New York tomorrow will have any experience of the real environment and the real decisions that you're chasing. So we can expect to have a very idealistic and a very distorted narrative coming from those groups that we're going to have to be in a position to confront. And I think the model of Allison's work and really falling back on the science is what we have to go forward with. Again, many of you are aware the National Pork Board released a prioritized vulnerabilities of the industry. I just show this to you to say, recognized as our number one vulnerability at the moment is the antibiotic issue and the impact it may have on the industry going forward. As in so many other issues like the GMO issue, developments in Europe have had a huge spillover effect and to continue to on our own debate and the way we go forward. And there's just several aspects of this I want to touch on. First is the whole philosophy of what we're doing in terms of antibiotic use in animal agriculture and the good and the bad and the ugly. Their philosophy is developed in a particular direction, and it hasn't developed in a vacuum. There's been a number of concerning organisms and resistance bug-drug pairs that have raised concerns that have been tied to human health risks that have driven this evolution of philosophy. And that's spilled over into action. And as we all know, we're facing substantial regulatory change in a few weeks from now in the US. The removal of growth promotants started in 1969 in the UK. was complete in the EU in 2006. So they've done that experiment. The next thing, the wave that happened, and that's a wave we're coming to, and I'll be talking about a little bit later, is the surveillance issue, measurement. How do we manage this issue if we don't measure this issue? And there's a lot of acronyms there, don't worry about them, but they're just different programs in different countries whose mission is to look at measuring antibiotic use, benchmarking antibiotic use, and that has been, again, evolving over the last 5 to 15 years. And the final part is this stewardship word, which is really the sort of word du jour in terms of judicious use of antibiotics in all arenas. And really, I think stewardship versus judicious use, inappropriate use, all these things, the real conceptual difference to me is it's more data-driven. It's more really looking at evaluating individual treatment decisions and when they're appropriate and inappropriate, and really moving beyond the decision-making context of the individual clinician and what they do to say, what are we doing as a profession in terms of making sure we're moving in the right direction? So there's a lot happening on the human side in terms of more disciplined stewardship program that we have in place, and obviously that is putting some pressure on the veterinary and other sectors to move in the same direction. Many of you remember the Y2K and the concerns coming up to that, and how the world was going to end and all those sorts of things, and it was hardly a ripple. I just put there, I'm not going to talk much about the legislation because I think everyone in the room is probably aware of it, but in January 1, 2017, we're going to have a really substantial change in antibiotic availability, antibiotic oversight in our industry. We all know this, and it will have impacts, and I'm not going to project on what they'll be because I'll be wrong. But there will be people who exit the industry. There will be animals that get sick. There will be severe disruption of the daily work routine of veterinarians in lots of sectors. So we know all those things are going to happen. What I want to talk about really is from a professional point of view, a little, maybe a higher level of what it means. And this is a Mike Apley quote. We've had over-the-counter, we've had growth promotion, we've had all these availability of antibiotics. So the key changes in the legislation are the removal of growth promotants, of medically important antibiotics for growth promotants, the removal of over-the-counter products except for injectables, and most importantly, veterinary oversight for all antibiotic uses in feed and water. As Mike Apley says, the veterinary profession has been handed the football. So we are now in a situation where we have more responsibility, more accountability, and we really need to make sure that we don't fumble, that we go forward, and that we're moving and progressing as an industry in an accountable way. The other thing is, and those who aren't Minnesotans may not realize we have a brand new football stadium that made its debut yesterday. We are now playing in a new stadium, and a lot of people are watching. So our veterinary activities for the last 40 or 50 years really have been to a certain extent under the radar because of the context we're in. Both socially, I think, because of consumers looking at us and other professions looking at us, we're now in a position where we're under the microscope for the first time. And again, this is some of the challenges I think we need to have in our mind going forward. How do we defend what we do? At the moment, I don't think there's any concerns on the green side there from the public, from most people, that sick animals need to be treated. Okay? I think as we move towards the red zone, the production uses, the growth promote and feed efficiency, they've gone away because they've not been defensible in the public forum. And I think, but in the middle, we have our batch medication, we have our control, we have our prevention uses, and they're the ones that our critics are now focusing on, and we have to be in a position that we can defend our practice and we can defend them based on scientific principles, and we have a little way to go. So growth promotion and our over-the-counter availability haven't been lost because of proof of harm. They've been lost because they're difficult or impossible to defend in today's society with the magnitude of this issue. Defense of prevention and control will require evidence, and I think what our evidence needs to start is that we are achieving benefits for animal health, well-being, food safety. There may be other things, but initially I think one of the big discussion points is who decides what's appropriate use. On the medical side, there's still no consensus. I heard that in Washington yesterday. We want things to be appropriate, but we don't actually agree or can't agree on what appropriate is. But what inappropriate is exposure to antibiotics without measurable benefit. And I don't think anyone disputes that. So we've got some work to do in terms of being able to shore up our argument and how we can move this forward. So what really matters, this is again in the opinion things, are we doing harm and how much? How do we use antibiotics in the industry? What's effective? What's necessary? What's philosophically defensible? How good is the evidence on all those sectors? And so for all areas I think we're going to be challenged to move forward on. Can we do better? Okay, so what are we talking about? And I've spent a lot of time at meetings on antibiotic use and resistance the last 12 months. And lots of people talk about the big bad bogeyman. This resistance is coming to get us. No specifics. No, well, what bugs and drugs are you really talking about? And I think this sort of cloud metaphor, so I've got some weather metaphors. So the cloudy one here, the resistance is this thing you can't grab, doesn't really advance the argument. Where we need to go is specific drugs, specific pathogens and antibiotics that are causing human health concerns to clinicians. And that's what my lightning thing is. We know there are public health impacts from these drugs and these resistance patterns. And the other metaphor is the drizzle one, where, yeah, there's lots of other bugs and drugs. We're worried about them. We don't really know whether there's harm involved. So I'll walk through it with that. CDC, several years ago, did this job. And they said, okay, these are the bugs and the drugs that are priorities in the United States for impact on health. I'm not going to read through them. There's lots of them. I'm going to so this is their version of the lightning. If we say, okay, where does animal health and the animal food system play into that, I push the button. And in terms of what's on their list, in terms of animal source being considered a credible concern of them, we're left with these two, our primary foodborne pathogens, Salmonella, Campylobacter. Okay, I'll come back to some of the drizzle later, but if we look what's happened, and go back to that, and this is US data from the CDC on prevalence of foodborne pathogens since 1996 to 2015. The black line is the overall incidence of the key foodborne pathogens they're tracking. The only one going up is actually Vibrio related to seafood, so it's not a terrestrial animal concern. Salmonella is the red line, it's trekked along, but those other pathogens have all gone down. 20 to 30% reduction in Listeria, Campylobacter, 0157. Salmonella hasn't changed. 60% reduction in Yersinia enterocolytica. And that's of interest to us because pork is considered overridingly, if not the sole meat source of Yersinia enterocolytica. So our industry has got better, and a lot of that I attribute to the improved slaughter hygiene that's happened since the regulatory changes exactly then in the mid-90s. So things have gotten better. Focusing down a little bit, and this is, again, national data from the USDA and the FDA's NARMS program, resistance monitoring. This is non-typhoid Salmonella, which is our primary foodborne pathogen in terms of incidence and deaths. And what we can see here is two things. The dark blue line is what's going on with multiple drug resistance to 3 or more antimicrobials over the last 20 or so years. And two things here. All those lines at the top are Salmonella from the food animal sector, either from the retail sector or for plant. We have much more multiple drug resistance in Salmonella in the food animal reservoirs than we're seeing in the human clinical situation. So our animal use, so animal practices, are arguably, and I would believe it, have led to a situation where we have fairly substantial reservoirs of multiple drug resistant Salmonella in our major foodborne species. What we really need to look at from the how much harm are we doing? So there's a reservoir there. 17% in 1996 of human clinical non-typhoid Salmonella were multiple drug resistance. The most recent data, 9.8%. So unlike many other areas, there's actually been progress. Things have gotten better, but it's very hard to find anyone in Washington, D.C. who actually pulls out this data and says it, other than me. We'll move back from the Salmonella, that's some good news, and say there's a whole lot of bugs that I'd put in the drizzle category. So each of these drugs and bugs has got its own story. It's not like they've got different life cycles, they've got different fitness in different sectors, in meat, in live animal, likelihood of transmission to people. We have one that has now been added, which is the colistin resistance with the MCR gene. That wasn't on the CDC's list, but it soon will be. I haven't got time to go through all these, but these are the ones, or some of them, that have really driven the discussion over the last 20 years. So I'll talk vancomycin-resistant enterococci, livestock-associated MRSA, ESBL enterobacteriaceae. They've really influenced regulatory changes in the EU over the last, particularly 5 to 10 years. There's also concerns about carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae. I've got that in grey because very few people, even internationally, because we've not had any carbapenem approval in food animals anywhere, really believe that the animal use. Colistin's a little bit different because it hasn't been widely used in animals. Okay, I'll tell a little bit about the avoparsin story because this is what really started it all in the EU. Avoparsin is a glycopeptide. It's related to vancomycin, which is one of the drugs of last reserve for severe human infections that are multiple drug resistance. It was widely used in Europe for growth promotion in pigs and poultry from the 1970s. Key point here, it was never licensed in the USA. Okay? What happened with VREs in Europe is that there was a very high prevalence of vancomycin-resistant enterococci in pigs and poultry. There was also 10% of healthy humans in the society. But VRE clinical infections remain rare. So we had a situation where the evidence was very strongly suggested that the animal sector in this reservoir was spilling over through the food chain and creating a reservoir of vancomycin-resistant enterococci in healthy humans. The concern that was going to be spilling over to the hospital. At the same time, and this is something key to remember, there was very, very little use of vancomycin in human medicine. So widely used by avoparsin in human medicine, very little vancomycin use in human medicine. So avoparsin in animal medicine. Avoparsin was banned in the EU, all the EU countries by 1997. So it really started this issue. This is a comparison here of a study looking at vancomycin use in the EU and in the USA. And the time periods are very important. You were looking from the mid-80s to the late 90s. Key thing here is in the USA, we have an order of magnitude higher use of vancomycin in the human medical sector than was going on in Europe. Okay? This is what was seen in the human clinical situation with vancomycin-resistant enterococci in hospital-acquired infections. So that time period, late 80s through the 90s, a very substantial increase. So we created a high prevalence of vancomycin-resistant enterococci in our medical sector, although we had no avoparsin, no glycopeptide use in the veterinary sector. This is, again, different study. This is Ephetium bacteremia, but we had comparison of European data with US data. Again, the key thing, two things there. Our North American prevalence is, again, an order of magnitude higher than was seen in the EU. And the EU was where there was avoparsin used and not much human use. And again, the emergence of vancomycin-resistant enterococci happened much later in the EU, but it all happened after avoparsin was withdrawn. So this VRE story is the most cited, the most discussed example of why we need to have concerns about animal use in the sector, even though, as I point out here, to do bad things, we have to, if we look across the bottom here, I'm not sure my pointer will work, to really create the problem, we need to use the antibiotic in the animal sector, select for the bug, it has to persist in the animal to slaughter. If we're talking foodborne routes, it's then got to contaminate the product, it's got to persist on the product, it's got to lead to human exposure. Those people then have to be exposed to an infectious dose, they have to get sick and have a treatment failure before we have a medical endpoint. Well, vancomycin was one that went most of the journey, but it still didn't cause that clinical concern of treatment failure. But it's still, and I think very appropriately was banned. I think it's very hard to go in and say, well, so it's not a bad thing to create all these healthy people walking around with vancomycin-resistant genes in their flora. I think it was a very conservative but a very reasonable decision to make. I'm now going to talk a little bit about livestock-associated MRSA. As many of you know, it's an area I've been working on the last few years. Nobody thought MRSA, again, is one of the superbugs, if I use the dreaded word, that's of most concern in the human medical community. Nobody thought animals had anything to do with it until 2004, when it was recognized there was this strange variant in the Netherlands that was highly prevalent in pig production and also prevalent in other species. So the world changed in terms of this issue in 2004. We now know people who are like you, who are working in close contact with animals, are at high risk of exposure and carrying livestock-associated MRSA in their nasal cavity. Orders of magnitude of increased risk of exposure for people working with animals. Again, human clinical cases have been reported. Some of them have been serious. Interestingly, there's very, very few reports of serious clinical infections in people working with swine. So the occupational group have very high exposure but appear to have very limited disease. There have been several deaths, and again, we look at magnitude, approximately 10 globally in 10 years. So that's about as much road death as will happen during my presentation in the US. So it's not zero, but it is there largely in medically compromised people, and most of the data suggests that there's very low exposure risk for anyone who's not working with animals directly. Ironically, to a certain point, the two countries that have been perhaps most active in recent years in reducing and addressing antibiotic use in livestock are currently at 90 to 100% prevalence of MRSA in their swine populations, as are several other countries in Europe, and that's Denmark and the Netherlands. In Denmark, MRSA infections in people are reportable. They always do a phenomenal job in surveillance and analysis of data. So this is what's happened over the last 7 or 8 years from the most recent report from Denmark in their human MRSA clinical infections. And you can see things have gone up. The most important thing, where I'll put the pig on here, is the CC398 or ST398, where you can see a substantial increase in human clinical infections with this particular livestock-associated variant, and that increase very closely mirrors the increase in prevalence in the Danish pig herd. So we have a situation here where we do have documented increases that are tied to the live animal sector. This is a publication that came out because the question comes back to what is the real health impact. This is a paper that came out about 12 months ago, which is a very comprehensive study looking at livestock MRSA in Denmark. I'll show you their conclusions and I'll show you their data. Because again, it's not only in the public sector that we see biases in interpretation of data. And I have one interpretation of the data and I have a different one. So what they stated was ST398, CC398 is a major cause of disease in Europe and poses a serious public health challenge in countries with intensive livestock production. Well, I think you're extrapolating beyond the source of your original data, but that is in the peer-reviewed publication they stated. It suggests substantial dissemination of MRSA from the livestock into the community. The findings strongly suggest, and this was perhaps the upside, but remember Denmark exports a lot of pork, foodborne transmission does not play a major role. And all the evidence, I think, does support that. Okay, so painting a very bleak picture. This is their data, and what they really did was look in areas geographically in Denmark where there was a high density of pig production versus a lower density. And remember, Denmark has about 3 times the pig density as Iowa, and a much higher human population density. If we look at all MRSA, the red number there, 10.9, that's how many clinical infections they had per 100,000 person years. In the other areas, it was a little higher. No statistically significant difference. But the trend is it didn't seem that you were a whole lot worse off in a pig-dense area. When we focus down on the livestock variant, the ST398, you can see there in the pig-dense area, not surprisingly, there's a higher incidence of the C398 than the in the non-pig dense area. And this is in people who had no pig contact. Okay? So there was a statistically significant difference in those particular livestock variants in pig dense areas. And that's the focus of the paper and their conclusions. The question is, where are you better off living at a wider level in terms of your absolute risk of MRSA infection? So we do have evidence of a specific increase, but not an overall increase. One thing some of our work and others has led to, and for reasons I don't understand, the livestock-associated MRSA are much, much less prevalent in the United States, and we've and others have published that. We have more varieties of MRSA that are found in the livestock section, these ST398, ST5, ST9, but overall our prevalence is low. Recently there's been 2 studies comparing human populations in Iowa in relation to the pig contact, and the carriage of MRSA and ST3 MRSA was the same in people. Well, this should be overall MRSA in people exposed and not exposed to pigs. Because we don't have a lot of MRSA in our pig population, there's not a measurable difference in risk. But there was increased exposure to multiple drug-resistant, methicillin-susceptible livestock variants. So that has become the focus. The other thing was a comparison or really an analysis of a large number of human diagnostic labs in Iowa that showed that the livestock-associated MRSA constituted 0.24% of MRSA in Iowa, our most populous swine state. So it is there, but in terms of impact on humans, well, that's how do we interpret that number? And I'll come back to that. So if we step back now and say, okay, we can argue all day about this data. I think the things we're going forward, we've got to take a position on how we address these concerns. The first thing is antibiotic use in any setting selects for resistance. Not much argument there. The next part of the argument is antibiotic use in animals, the contribution is greater than 0. And I think that means we have an ethical responsibility to examine what we're doing. Even if no impact is great, there's no justification for inappropriate usage, however we define that. And these are, again, opinions and ideas from me that I think are, I guess, to focus our debate. Lack of proof of harm is not an argument for injudicious use. Okay? Just because you can't show we're doing things that are affecting people doesn't mean we can do silly things. The other argument is that what's going on in developing countries, China, India, antibiotics all over the place. I've worked in Latin America. I've seen it. I've bought them over the counter and used them myself inappropriately. Because there's great abuse in other countries, that is not an argument for injudicious use here. If I see someone speeding at 100 miles an hour, does that give me licenses to go 95? Probably not. And again, a lot of this is our mindset. I think we have to examine our mindset and how we tackle this issue. Is there room for improved stewardship in food animal industries? Okay, touch the audience participation here. US residue data monitoring showed that greater than 13% of market hogs had vial of antibiotic residues. True or false? Okay, true. In 1978. Okay? If we look at the most recent data, in all species, scheduled testing by the FSIS, 0.17% of residues. And the scheduled testing is a formal random sample of species. And you can see of those 10 where they were distributed, there were no in market hogs or in sows in this year. In other years, there's been a small number. 0 had violative residues. There's also testing done on what are called inspected generated animals, which aren't randomly selected. They're inspectors saying we should test these animals for whatever reason. Extremely low. So I'd say we've come a long way. And we've come a long way in so many areas in this industry. I know I've heard Tim Lawler speak, I know many of you have, in how things really were and how things are today. And I've worked myself on foodborne safety and how far the pig industry's progressed Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to get translated into the public appreciation. And this residue data is just how far we've come from a truly horrendous situation, which interestingly created no public outrage in the 1970s, even though this data was publicly available. Whereas if we had 1/10 of that now, we'd be hauled off to court. There's this concept of the paradox of progress, meaning what happens as society evolves. As we get better or we progress as a society, we create more problems. And there's lots and lots of examples. Higher economic growth and consumerism brings more stress. People work more, society falls behind. These are not my ideas. The more we know, the more we have to discover. That's great if you're in academia. The last point is the one I want to focus on. The better things become, the worse they are perceived. And these are some perceptions. So on this document, I just want to draw attention to where it came from. This is a discussion document posted on the website of the National Academy of Medicine. The authors are prominent clinicians, scientists involved in antibiotic resistance research and policy, should I say. And this is what they're saying about us. I have to come over here because I can't. But I think the first point is in relation to action on antibiotic use, the burden of proof should be placed on those who oppose reducing use rather than the other way around. They're saying ethically it is the animal industries have to show why they don't want to reduce use. The burden of proof of that is on us, not on them. That's an important point. Antibiotics are a shared societal trust of property. It's not acceptable for one group of people to abuse this trust while harming everyone else. Maybe a little bit of overstatement there, but this is the language, and this isn't from wingnut consumer groups. This is from people with scientific credentials and more credibility in the street than anyone from the veterinary side will have, whether or not they're whistling Dixie. Many parties promote routine use of antibiotics in livestock to maximise production and profits. We've heard that greedy, money-hungry people pouring in antibiotics in bad systems to make themselves rich. That narrative is still there. Thus, a group of people in society are using antibiotics injudiciously to mask inferior management practices. And I'm putting this up because, as we said before, we've come so far on so many levels, but this is mainstream narrative. If the time I've spent in Washington, D.C. In the last 12 months, this is not a few people on the outside. This is very much the narrative that is moved more and more in the mainstream. So, again, a question here, how good is our antibiotic use and stewardship in the swine industry? And my scale there is from how bad they say we are to how good we say we are. And I've been in conversations where I've heard veterinarians say, well, all antibiotics are being used judiciously in the pig industry. Yesterday in DC, there was data shown that over 30% of antibiotics used in human medicine are used inappropriately. We may be better or worse than them. I don't think we're perfect. And I think claiming we're perfect doesn't do a lot for our credibility. I think we really need to look at our issues and where we go forward, and going forward with good intent and a positive mindset to address things that are very, very thorny. The next point is, can we manage it if we don't measure it? I'll just show where, I'll just check my time here so I don't get into too much trouble. We're very used to having the example of Denmark sort of put in front of our faces and say we should be doing what Denmark has done, and then everything will be wonderful. In reality, I think we can get used to the idea that the changes in Holland that have been more recent have now become probably what we're going to be seeing more of, because in the last 4 or 5 years, in the Netherlands, they've reduced antibiotic use in their live animal sectors by, here it's saying 56%. In the pig industry, it's 54%. And they've done that by a variety of mechanisms, but they've had a substantial reduction in antibiotic use that is saying, and apparently without substantial reduction of production, animal health impacts. So again, is it possible? Is it true? But certainly it's something that we can't ignore. The other thing, and this is probably a more novel thing, is that they've looked at resistance. So this is data from actually E. coli, resistance to lots of drugs, looking at what's happened, overall resistance. So this isn't foodborne pathogens. This isn't known human pathogens. This is what's going on in the animal's guts. And they've measured, and in the pig sector, it was a reduction of 23%. So they had a 54% reduction in antibiotics use that translated to a 23% reduction, and that shouldn't surprise us if we believe in selection pressures. But again, the example being they've done it, they've had impact. I've asked the question actually of the people who shared this to me. He said, well, what's going on the human side? Have you measured anything yet to show there's a measurable improvement on the human side? To start with, they have very low resistance. They said the answer was in a forum like this was, in 4 or 5 years, we may have some data to show. And I think that's probably a realistic assessment because it's very hard to measure these things. Okay, so in terms of measuring antibiotic use, which all we have in the USA at the moment is by sales, I just got this up. I won't go through it for time, but there's lots and lots of groups saying we need to measure antibiotic use in food animal productions to know what's happening, to potentially give a basis for forcing reduction, but also understand what we're doing. The one I'll note at the bottom there is the National Action Plan. That's the US national. So we have a national action plan. The committee I was at yesterday, that's meeting again today, is involved with assessing the progress of that plan. It didn't develop the plan, but there's a couple of things stated. First of all, there's 5 platforms that I'll just let you look at there that are saying these are the areas that this national plan addresses. And point 2 there is surveillance. Point 1 is largely stewardship. Under those plans, if we look at the red boxes there, this is what's stated in the national plan: to develop appropriate metrics to gauge the success of stewardships and guide continuing evolution and optimization for antibiotics in animals. So our national plan is telling us this is something that should be done, and under another objective, implement voluntary monitoring of antibiotic use and resistance in pre-harvest settings, meaning farms, to get nationally representative data while maintaining producer confidentiality. So this is an area that I'm sort of wrestling with others at the moment in terms of how does the industry move forward and try and move into this space before someone else moves into this space in perhaps a less friendly area. So steps forward. The FDA and the USDA put plans forward to do this. Congress didn't fund it. So we have a bit of an unfunded mandate in terms of measurement of antibiotic use. This is raising the attention of voluntary programs. Liz Wagstrom, who's not here today because she's in DC, has been integral in having conversations with what's called the barnyard group. So this is all our major food animal species, sitting down and saying, and I've been in several of these messages, how do we move forward with this issue collectively? Because we didn't really want this to be a competitive issue among the meat industries, but how do we all go forward in terms of addressing this challenge? Major issues are the metrics and what do we measure, the confidentiality piece, how do we get data that's representative, and last but not least, how do we get buy-in from the veterinary profession, from our industries, that this is something that has more benefit than it has risk, because it does potentially have both those things. On the other side, and I'll mention this already, the poultry industry, the broiler industry specifically, is already a year or two ahead of everything else, and Dr. Randy Singer, who's at the University of Minnesota, is in the center of developing a system for and collecting data on the broiler industry. So again, we have the situation, and there's also other market-driven initiatives, because one of the bullet points in who wants this, there's more and more pressure coming back from customers in the food animal sectors to say, we want to know what's going on in our supply chain because we want to be able to tell our consumers that everything is okay in the supply chain. So it's not just coming from the social end, the pressures are also coming from our industry and our customers. So it's a very hard one to put our head in the sand on. Okay. With the pork boil itself, I just put this up because this is a major priority. They've increased funding available for antibiotic resistance research. My sabbatical project was funded out of that initiative. We've established a task force specifically on measurement of antibiotic use. Several people in the room have been involved. This is very new. Our first meeting was on June 2nd. We're moving forward. And again, our purpose is not to find a number that has to be reduced, but say, okay, where is the benefit in benchmarking, measuring what we're doing, look at systems, understanding how antibiotics are used. And this is a consensus across the food animal industries, is that the purpose we want to measure for is to get better at what we're doing and understand what we're doing rather than create a magic number that people will turn around and tell us to reduce. And we're in the early stages now of just trying to get a proposed pilot project going forward with a small number of systems to really look at the methodology in terms of metrics, the confidentiality, what are the roadblocks that we've got for this going forward. Okay, nearly out of time here, so I just looking forward on this issue and where it might be going. One thing that's inevitable, increasing scrutiny. This is not going to go away. I think what we've done for the last 40 to 50 years or longer, we need to continue. We need to continue to get better. And we all, again, the ongoing challenge of really getting people to recognize and acknowledge the improvements that we've made collectively as an industry, because it is carbon footprint, food safety, productivity, cost of product to consumers. Consumers have been major beneficiaries of our industry developments, the development of export industries. There's very little that we don't have to be proud of, but we're struggling again to communicate that. How we're using antibiotics, really, and again, this is a mindset thing here. I think we've, and we have very, very diverse opinions in the room about how good we are, but I think we all have to get better. We have to have a mindset of asking the questions about what we're doing, and are we really realizing the benefits? Is there scope for reduction? A big area on the human medical side is duration of treatment. We don't really know much about how necessary is duration of treatment. On the human, particularly on the urinary tract infection, it's something they're looking at, and they're realizing for most people, 1 or 2 days of treatment is all you need, whereas most people are given 14 days of antibiotics. So they're working very actively in the medical sector to try and understand those issues. I think that's an area of great demand in our own industry, because most of our collective knowledge on what works and doesn't work is not in the peer-reviewed public sector. It's in the collective experience of the people in this room. And I think one of the things we have to look at is how do we move forward collectively to try harness some of that information, particularly when we're looking at preventive uses that are most critical to animal health and well-being. And this is where I'm really getting to the measurement piece and evidence-based treatment, understanding what we're doing. Okay, I'll close here on a quote again that I've liked for a long time. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And my take on that, so therefore is the future. So we're looking back at what we've done, where we've come, and I think we really need to say, okay, we're in this new stadium. People are looking. We've got these challenges. We're a progressive industry. How do we collectively move forward so that we are in control of this issue rather than having this issue being in control of us? Thank you.